Yeah, sure.
Ok, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue à une conférence de la part du réseau en théorie internationale. Today we have the very good fortune to have Nolen Gertz from the University of Twente here to speak on the subject of his latest forthcoming book, forthcoming in July, Nihilism and Technology. Dr. Gertz is the author of a book, The Philosophy of War and Exile, From the Humanity of War to the Inhumanity of Peace, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2014, critique of just war theory and of PTSD theory. And he has also edited previous volumes on war fronts, interdisciplinary perspectives on war, virtual war, and human security. He has written articles and papers on a vast variety of fascinating subjects, ranging from killing and military training and professionalism, the political ethics of robotic technologies in unmanned warfare, the ethics of freedom versus responsibility or designed responsibility, the philosophy of action figures, terror, terrorism, and torture, the phenomenology of light, Gamergate and gaming journalism, crises of faith in TV shows, the philosophy of the Yankees-Red Sox rivalry, and on the need to take seriously the theological basis of just war theory. He's also a 21st century version of the Renaissance man, producing comics, art, and various physical commodities. He intervenes regularly in the media in different countries and has a blog and a website, Ethicist for Hire. And with no further ado, I'd like to present to you Dr. Nolen Gertz.
Thanks. So this is, I guess, sort of a premature launch event. The book doesn't actually come out until July. So I guess I have to build up a lot of excitement to carry over for about 3-4 months. I don't have a clicker, so I'm going to be going back and forth. I hope that doesn't cause anyone too much whiplash. So at the, I was trying to work up how exactly to present this, because I've given about 10 or 15 different versions of this talk, because I've been working on the book for the last couple of years. And I woke up this morning, every story on the news was about Facebook. It seemed relevant. So one thing I intend to do is explain Facebook today. It should only take about 10 minutes at the most. It's really not that complicated. It's bad. But it's worse than you think. That's sort of the summary of the talk today. It's all just worse than you think. That's the main point. And hopefully at least the cover image is gleeful for you. So, what am I doing? I'm one of these weird people who studied what's called continental philosophy for their PhD, which basically means you can't get hired, but you can have interesting conversations. A lot of them are about this guy, Nietzsche, who I'll be talking about later. Because the main thing that I'm trying to do with this book is to essentially bring Nietzsche to bear on technology. So that's where we're going with all of this. And I think a good place to start, because I find this I find this a weirdly compelling question. I don't know if you do. Why does anyone use technology? Because it really is weird to me why we do anything that we do. That's already kind of weird for me, and why I'm probably in philosophy. But now that I work at one of the technical universities in the Netherlands, I'm sort of surrounded by technology all the time. Every course in my department is technology focused. Everything I teach for the last 3 years has been technology focused. Everyone who comes there is to do technology. So it's, to some extent, my university's fault that I've become so obsessed with this issue. So let's try to answer it. So one place to start would be, of course, advertising. I gave a TEDx talk on Netflix and chill, so I'm not going to go into that too much. You can look it up if you want. One thing I found very amusing was the number of people who felt the need to explain to me what Netflix and chill meant. Apparently they thought I missed the point, which I thought was quite interesting. And it is interesting because if you don't know the history of it, Netflix and chill, there is a history of it. It started out as something that people used in order to indicate, leave me alone. Like, I'm going to spend the night in watching Netflix, don't bother me. So this was the equivalent of putting a do not disturb sign. And what's interesting is how it evolved over time into, on the first hand, a euphemism. And then secondly, most importantly, as you can see here, Netflix branding. So this was a ground-up advertising campaign, as it were. What I find perhaps most compelling is the Google Home, its own variety of privacy issues, which we can talk about. But if you watch the commercials, if you've seen any commercials for these voice-assisted devices, one theme I find running throughout these commercials is that they seem to be aware these devices serve no point, and that nobody really wants them because they don't really do anything. So in the Google commercial, there's someone who will be like, turn off the lights, but they're standing like 5 feet away, like they could do it. They'll ask, like, hey, what's the weather? But again, like, you could look out the window. So it's very clearly a gadget that you don't need. It's not even clear that you want it, other than you could want it and you could have it, so why not, right? I was brought to a German company. They asked me to sign a non-disclosure agreement, so I'm not going to tell you which one. But they wanted me to help them develop their voice assistant technology. And what I found especially fascinating was they wanted me to help them to figure out how to get people to do what the voice assistant told them to do. And I said, you're trying to fix a problem that doesn't exist. That people do what it tells them to do. Like, you don't have to do anything. If anything, our concern should be how to get people to stop doing what the voice assistant tells them to do. So it was a short visit. That's the main takeaway. As Kevin indicated, I already wrote a book on drones. You can read that on your own time, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. But what I do find fascinating is how quickly we commercialized weapons of war. Like when I was at the airport on the way here, I could buy a drone in the airport. I found this especially weird because you obviously could not use it. And it's quite possible you would have trouble getting through security with it. So why the hell are they selling it there? Like, what's happening here, right? Anyway, I'm not going to. I can spend an hour talking about that. This one is really my favorite, though. This is probably more than anything what triggered the book. Because if you see what's going on here, this family is finally happy. Even the dog is finally happy. And it seems all thanks to this black hockey puck, right? And what's fascinating is when, this is Roomba, when Roomba uses this ad, they don't have to, and they don't use the word Roomba anymore. And it's not actually clear immediately what they're selling you, except you can kind of figure it out, because what they're selling you is clearly not a vacuum thing. What they're selling you is an experience. What they're selling you is freedom, right? What they're selling you is happiness, family togetherness. We can finally be the couch fort family we've always wanted to be, because we are finally liberated from chores. from the horrible, horrible pessimists. And that's really what all of these have in common, right? That's really what ties them all together. So this idea, which you see in tech companies, importantly, it's not a new idea that we want leisure. Aristotle was obsessed with this idea. Leisure is for Aristotle the end of life. It is the goal of politics. And so you can sort of see already in Aristotle why tech companies are doing what they're doing. They're doing what Aristotle told them to do. Right? And what's especially fascinating, how do you get leisure? If you haven't read Aristotle's Politics before, spoiler alert, slavery. Slavery is how you so really, we haven't moved that far. It's important to think about. Most of the technologies we're relying on, we have a similar relationship as we did with slaves, and similar ethical issues. What happens if it learns? What happens if it tries to kill me? And can I have sex with it? So really, our debates about robots are debates about slaves. It's all the same. And it's all clearly about, I just want leisure. So it's important to think about, we're not against slavery, clearly. It's only about who has to be a slave. And that question is the only thing that keeps changing over historical time. But what's interesting is another person is also on this bandwagon, Karl Marx. Karl Marx similarly wants us moving in this direction. What's different between Marx and Aristotle, of course, Marx doesn't want slavery. So Marx is basically saying, I want Aristotle for everybody. So how do we get that? And his argument, which again you can see in tech companies today, well, we just need to have centralized decision-making. And then you get this beautiful picture of a communist society, which is more or less virtual reality, where you can just kind of play at any lifestyle you want and be free. So this brings us to the central question. Technology is clearly giving us half of the equation. So being a good Nietzschean, I'm not going to give you an answer. I want to leave open this question, also because it would be a very short talk if I just gave you the answer right now. But it is important to think about. I don't want us to only think about the question of, are technologies freeing us or oppressing us? Because the central argument of my book is basically that's the wrong question. I think what's more important to think about is how technology changes what we mean by liberation in the first place. So that's what I want to talk about. So next question. What actually is technology? So if you were taking an intro philosophy of technology class, you might have something like this. We can all pretty much agree technology has something to do with human evolution. You've all seen 2001: A Space Odyssey, I presume. You can draw a straight line from picking up the bone to space station, right? Then the question just becomes, and this is sort of the question that Kubrick is, of course, compelled by, so is it good or bad? One end of the spectrum, anyone know this guy? Curious.
Heidegger?
Heidegger, there you go. Not running for president. So Martin Heidegger, question concerning technology, 1951, I believe. And this is actually his rehabilitation tour. So again, spoiler alert, he was a Nazi. Which is kind of ironic when you think about it, and part of why philosophers are bad at politics. So he's very anti-technology. So who does he join than Nazis? He misread the tea leaves on that. But like a good academic, he basically saw that that was the best way to tenure. So that's also kind of a problem. Anyway. What Heidegger argues in the question concerning technology is that basically technology isn't a thing. It's not any collection of things. It's about literally the logos of techne. So it's about a way of relating to the world. And what he thinks is that basically we've become unable to relate to the world other than through technology. That technology has become all-consuming. I'm trying to avoid all Heidegger language here. So no Gestell, no framing. But the gist, which is really all you need to know for this, is that he says we have no control over technology. And the worst thing you can do, according to Heidegger, is to think you do. So what Heidegger is most worried about is our desire to instrumentalize technology, which I will come back to over and over again throughout the talk. But that for Heidegger is the worst way to relate to technology, which he also says is the most common. Technology is just a tool. Can't be good or bad. It's just how you use it. And what's interesting is that's essentially the utopian view. Because technology is just a tool, because it's just how you use it, then obviously we're going to use it for progress, and it's the best way to achieve progress. Just look at how awesome life is today. I can talk to you with PowerPoint. I don't have to rely on your imagination. So isn't that great? But are these the only perspectives? Of course not. The most complicated word philosophy has created yet, perhaps. Postphenomenology. Yes, I students love it. And this is the philosophy we are most associated with at the University of Twente. Postphenomenology. And the idea is that basically Heidegger was kind of half right. That's the central post of phenomenology. So Heidegger was right that we need to pay attention to technology, that this is the central concern that philosophy should have. He was just wrong about all the negatives. And what you see, I apologize, I like Photoshop a lot. I have made the Matrix version of the duck rabbit. Because that's basically what postphenomenology is all about. This idea that the question of is it good or bad, the answer is yes. It's both. And that really you can't understand what technology is without combining all possible perspectives. In other words, there is no stable relationship to any technology. There is no essential relation to technology. There are multiple stable relationships. And that's what postphenomenology wants to research. So, traditionally we've said subjects and objects exist independently of each other. This is what we call dualism. What Heidegger helps us to do is to say, as we often do with dualisms, it's wrong. Subjects and objects cannot be so neatly divided off of each other. In fact, if we want to get complicated philosophy about it, they co-constitute each other. I am what I am through my relationship with things. Things are what they are through their relationship with me. So one way to think about this that I like, because I'm a parent, and I am frequently telling my son he's using the fork wrong. And it's important to think about how both normal it is to say that, but also how weird it is to say it, right? Because what does it mean to use a fork wrongly, right? My son is clearly responding in a Heideggerian fashion to the fork calling to him, right? And I'm trying to tell him as a parent, don't listen to the fork, listen to me, right? So I am good phenomenologist in the classroom, bad at the kitchen table. That's the idea, right? And it's important to realize that basically, from a post-phenomenological perspective, there is no such thing as a fork. I'm going to sound a little like Keanu Reeves. There, there is a utensil, an artwork, a weapon. And a fork is all of these things. This is why if you use only one to describe a fork, you're only getting part of the story. And the idea here is the fork, again, in the relation, is both revealed what it is, but also what I am. So that's the key insight of postphenomenology. Don Ihde, the guy who started this crazy postphenomenology thing, makes an interesting point in his 1990 Technology and Life World, where he says, because technologies are transformative, because they shape our relationships to the world, they are clearly not neutral. But what they reveal, and this is what, again, Heidegger's answer to the question of what is technology. Technology is revealing. So what postphenomenology wants to say is that what it reveals is that we use technology because we want change. We want something in our situation to be different than what it is without technology. And what he says is, if you look at how people relate to technology, you see that we both want and do not want the technology. In other words, we want the transformation. We do not want the technology to be doing it. So I want what technology gives me, but I do not want technology to be giving it to me. Right? So I want, for example, my eyesight through the glasses, but I don't want the glasses. And I can't get away from it. But importantly, he says, the way we talk in our everyday lives, I say, I see you. And I effectively erase the technology. Because that's not really what's happening. What's really happening is I see the glasses seeing you. And this is Heideggerian-wise. It's only when something doesn't work that this is revealed to me. When I have to clean my glasses, when my son takes my glasses off my face, then I am painfully aware. And this is what's most important for postphenomenology, is this dynamic of technology both revealing but also withdrawing. So it's ever present, it's ubiquitous. But because of its very ubiquity, it's also invisible. And that's exactly what we want, but that's also what makes it so dangerous. And so Ihde puts it, there's a fundamental ambivalence. And this is, for me, why I try to bring Ihde and Nietzsche together, this concept of this fundamental ambivalence. What does that really mean? So, when we schematize what he's talking about, he says, human technology relations exist along a continuum from technologies that are sort of like me to technologies that are sort of like another being. So on the one hand, we have embodiment relations like my glasses. They give me powers that I would not have otherwise. We have hermeneutic relations in the middle. These are like when you relate to a computer. So computers allow me access to information I would not have without them. And then alterity relations are when I'm actually aware of the technology as a technology. But what's important, as Ihde points out, is that this, again, isn't the whole story. In each case, technologies both give, they also take away. So my empowerment relations, I have eyesight I would not have without the glasses, but at the same time, without the glasses, I don't have the eyesight. So they reduce me as much as they elevate. And importantly, it's important to think about, glasses are actually making your eyesight worse. So the more you wear the glasses, the worse your eyes become. And this is typical. Same thing has been studied in London cab drivers using mapping of your phone. That their brains are actually not as developed as cab drivers' brains used to be, because they're now relying on the phone, the GPS. They don't have to memorize. Hermeneutic relations. Well, this is fake news. The computer is my source of information. But I don't know that what the computer knows is knowledge. I just know what the computer tells me. So the famous case Don Ihde focuses on is the 3 Mile Island incident. The computer said everything was fine because what the problem was the computer. And that's how you get nuclear meltdown. So often, if you're driving a car, the engine light goes on. You don't know if it's the engine or the light. It's that kind of worry. Alterity relations, this is probably the most common one. I'm fascinated by technology, but because I see it as another, I come to see it as a threat. So, what do we do with all this? Let's get into the fun stories of the day. What do technologies actually do to us? This is one of my favorite examples. Do you remember Apple Maps? It's kind of weird to think back. It feels like that was 50 years ago. Apple Maps comes out, tries to compete with Google Maps. It looks exactly like Google Maps, except it's dumb. It's just dumb Google Maps. And what's interesting is I love these kinds of headlines. It's very important in order to understand the zeitgeist to understand these headlines. So what was happening was people were listening to Apple Maps, because that's what you do, and then doing things like driving into a lake. I think I saw a story just yesterday, an Uber automated car drove over a staircase, because that's what the car was told to do. So the drivers did it. And again, what's fascinating is the use of a word like hapless. What does that mean that you're hapless? I mean, if this was a person in the car telling you, take a right, do you just do it? Probably not, especially because you're likely to look. But for some reason, when Apple tells you, take a right, it's that confident, calming female voice. And we could, of course, spend a long time talking about why it has to be a female voice. It tells you to take a right, you do it. And then importantly, when you're in the water, you're blaming Apple. It's very fascinating. So what's going on there? Another way to think about it, the Cambridge Analytica way to think about it, if you didn't already see this tweet. As often happens now, a tech company does something bad, they turn to Twitter to apologize, except they don't really apologize. So it's important to read the whole thread, because once you get to 5 of 8, it's not our fault, you're an idiot. Now, what's fascinating, and I don't believe they've changed this yet, if you go to their website, Cambridge Analytica uses data to change audience behavior. So, which is it? Do we believe the tweet? Do we believe the website? Because they seem to have made billions of dollars on one model. And then they defend everything they do on the tweet model. So it's important to think about which is it. And I'm going to answer that, because again, that's what I woke up this morning hearing every news story about. So let's just give an actual answer to the question. In fact, I can give you at least 3 different answers to it. So the concept of technological influence, not new. It's been around for a while. If you've read Langdon Winner, that's again one of those philosophy of technology standards. He starts with the idea that technology is actually part of our politics. Ackridge and Latour are part of what's known as STS, Science and Technology Studies, and Peter Paul Vermeek is my boss. So I'm going to attack him the most, but we'll get to that. So Langdon Winter's famous argument from 1980. Robert Moses basically created New York City. He was also a racist. And those two things can be revealed in their conjoined architectural productions. Most famously is this overpass in Long Island Expressway. If you drive out of New York City north, there are very nice fancy beaches. This is where rich people go. And what's interesting is these overpasses are much lower than any other overpass. Overpasses are traditionally at least 12 feet high. These are only about 8. So Langdon Winter argues one way of interpreting this is that basically if you do not want poor people going to the beach, then you make an overpass that does not allow a bus to go through it. So this is discrimination built into the artifact. The artifact will not allow people who have to take the bus to go to the beach. When I teach industrial design, I tend to annoy my students because when they're designing, the first question I typically ask them is about accessibility. So for example, if you have a revolving door, people with wheelchairs can't get in. And what's interesting is as soon as I point out these accessibility issues, like having stairs because they're aesthetically pleasing, but again, can't get over. My students get very upset because they say, well, I'm not discriminating. I just didn't think about it. And I said, right, that's worse. It would have been fine if you had been like, well, I hate disabled people. Because then at least you're thinking about it. But to you, they just don't exist. And that's really more charming. Right? It's always better to be hated than just ignored, as you discover at like a high school reunion. So that's one way to think about technology. The STS way of thinking about it, Madeline Ackridge and Bruno Latour, technologies can be thought of more like film scripts. And the idea that basically the designer is inscribing intentions into the design, that the user will then subscribe to, and that the design prescribes to the user. My favorite example of this, sorry, I skipped a step. So Bruno Latour takes Ackridge's script idea, and in this famous paper, Where Are the Missing Masses, basically says, we don't have to worry that people are becoming worse, that people are becoming more immoral, because technologies can fill in the gap. So technologies make us better. This is his comforting idea. And his example, which I love, is this key. So there's a German hotel manager, and it's important that he's German. German hotel manager is trying to get people when they leave the hotel to lock the door. So he puts a sign, please lock the door. Nobody does. He puts this heavy block on every room key that says, please lock the door. Nobody does it. This is why it's important he's German. So being a German, he goes to an engineer, and he explains this problem, and he says, fix this. And the engineer comes up with a brilliant solution, a two-headed key and a lock, where the only way to get your key is from the other side of the door after you lock it. We're about as un-Kantian as possible, and yet still very German. It's weird how we can do that at the same time. So another way to think about this, Bruno Latour also talks about the speed bump. So you have probably driven through a school zone. You've probably seen a sign like this. Oh, I guess it's also in French here. And it's kind of fascinating when you have the speed bump. You have speed bumps in Canada, correct? Yes. Okay. You might not think about speed bumps. I think a lot about speed bumps. I find speed bumps offensive. Because what they're basically saying is, we get it, you want to murder children. But we're hoping you don't want to murder your car. Because again, otherwise the sign would be enough. School zone, slow down. And we're like, no, that doesn't work. Because so maybe the speed bump will do it, right? So you have the inscription, you build something that forces you to slow down. The product makes you slow down. Unsung hero. I think Renaud Latour calls it the sleeping police officer. I love it. But importantly, as postphenomenology points out, because of multi-stability, scripts don't really work. Because you cannot say that the speed bump has to have the essence slow down. Because it could actually be reinscribed by the user into a fun way to actually get some air. In other words, the safety device could actually make things more dangerous, not less. So just to sum up, STS is wrong. That's the end. So post-phenomenology, my boss is right. shocking twist. So Peter Paul Verbeek argues it's more complicated than STS. It's more complicated than scripts. Because we have to realize that all three, the user, the designer, and the technology itself, shape the mediation, shape how technologies mediate our relationship to the world. So you can never say in advance what it will do. And if you leave out the technology's multi-stability, then you are going to essentialize, instrumentalize the technology, and again, not see all the full range of possibilities of what could happen. So this is what post-phenomenology wants to do. So let's apply post-phenomenology. I just came through the airport, so this experience is very relevant to me. I don't know if you've ever been in this kind of a situation, but have you ever been in a queue? I'll be British for a second. Have you ever been in a queue and been like, why are we doing this? What the hell's happening here? Because you notice if you ever try to bring children through an airport, they get it, right? Like, what are we doing? We're human beings. We're not animals. So I'm just going to go nuts. I'm not going to stay in line. That's stupid. I want to go there. I'm going to go there. And children just do it. And then we yell at them and yank them back violently. And I think the reason we do that is because they reveal to us how animalistic we have become. That we are perfectly happy to be the cow in line waiting to be slaughtered. I think this is why we don't let children in bars. Because children would really point out how stupid the whole bar thing is. You're like, what are we doing here? You drink stuff that doesn't taste good. You're trying to talk to people, but you don't say what you mean. All of this is dumb. And you keep it as dark as possible. But at some point, you're going to see them in the full light of day, and it's going to be, oh, what's happening? Anyway. Sorry, tangent. So, I love this article. It's a great article. Whenever I bring it up, and I bring it up all the time, my boss importantly wants me to point out he's the third author. The reason I point that out is because I think this is one of the worst articles ever written. I don't mean worst like philosophically or grammatically. I mean just what it implies. Because it's a brilliant article, but what it implies is horrifying. So if you've heard anything about persuasive technology, BJ Fogg, that whole thing, Cass Sunstein. Peter Paul, well, I should, Trump, Hecker, and Verbeek, third author, point out that we have figured out a lot about the idea that technologies are persuasive. But we haven't figured out really how people actually feel about being persuaded and how to design in light of how people feel about it. So they are going to essentially apply postphenomenology to this question. One example that he gives is designers trying to deal with the problem of obesity. And he says basically there are two ways of doing this. On the one hand, as social science has helped to reveal to us, if you give people a smaller plate, they're likely to take less food. The reason for this being, we are activating your shame response. Smaller the plate, the more the pile. I had lunch before now at the food court, which was all you can eat. I did not realize that going in. And I was just making a mess. I was disproving, I was refuting this claim. But it's a well-researched idea. Smaller the plate, smaller food. Another way of doing it is to just make healthier food look like unhealthy food. Because it's important, for a long time, healthy food looked like something that fell off a truck. It was something in a sack. It looked like it should be tied to a stick or something. You should be eating it on a train track. It did not look appealing, is what I'm getting at. And the idea was we can activate people's sense of class, basically, by just using fancier branding, fancier decoration. So the idea was, if you understand which kind of individual concerns we're working with, then you know which one to trigger. So again, it's about understanding the user better and not just using one approach in all situations. So, the big question is, what do we do about these times when collective and individual concerns conflict with each other? And I always tell my students, parentheticals are where the action is. So, what is best for the collective, and thus on average also for the individual, is not always felt or experienced as best for the individual. It's a very Rousseauian idea, right? So how do we deal with that? So this is one example. You've probably seen a situation like this. And I often ask my students, just explain this to me. Explain how this happens. Because if you ask any person on the street, do you want garbage on your street? They will say no. And what's interesting is my philosophy students give a very different answer as to why this happens than my design students do. Anyone want to guess what the design answer is?
There are no trash cans.
Yeah, design students pick up on this very quickly. There's a design flaw. Where's the trash can? Philosophy students go into this convoluted argument about responsibility, social, there's no damn trash can. But what's interesting is, again, why should that matter? Right? Why does the lack of a trash can then justify garbage? And my idea is that it probably started with this, one small piece of trash. And that you see one piece of trash, and you, unconsciously or otherwise, feel that this is now a place to put trash. This is what's known as broken windows theory in sociology. Right? It takes one small crack for the whole foundation to start wiping away. Right? So one piece of trash gives rise to more pieces of trash, gives rise to more pieces of trash, and you just have litter alley. Right? So, the idea here is design, again, just build a damn trash can, would bridge the concern between the individual who doesn't want to be inconvenienced holding trash because there is no trash can, and the collective concern, none of us want trash on the street. So design has to figure out the solution, and again the question is, how do we elicit the right behavior? Here's another fun example. In the Netherlands, train stations, we have these kinds of gates. Maybe you've seen train station gates like this. Why? Why do we design the gate this height? Any guess why it's this high?
So it's impossible to jump.
It can't jump over. And again, what's important is, so the design is telling you, you're a dirty thief and I don't trust you. But the signs in the station go a different route. They say instead, please don't forget. Don't forget to tap your card before you leave. And they play up this idea that, you're busy, you're going to forget stuff. We've all been there. So we built this gate to prevent you from being forgetful. So their argument is that basically you can put any design strategy on this framework. And if you understand human psychology, then you can design to elicit behavior by designing in the right approach. Realize I'm taking more time, so I'll move a little faster. Sums it up. So coercive influence, you've probably seen packaging like this for cigarettes. Coercion takes place anytime there's an or else. So whenever the design says, do it or you're going to die, coercion. Persuasive influence. This is one of my favorite designs. How do you get people to wash their hands in the bathroom? And the way to do it was this complicated lighting that would tell everyone else you did not wash your hands. It would have like a red light outside the bathroom, and then you would leave. So there is no or else, but it's probably a good idea not to be that guy, right? Seductive influence. This is another fun one. Dutch designer. Social cups. The idea is, and this is something my design students are obsessed with. I don't know if you've experienced this. People are antisocial and want to design something to make them social. So how do you do it? You design a cup that you literally cannot put on a table without it spilling. The only way to stop it from spilling is to get someone else to hook their cup to your cup. And again, I'm fascinated by this idea because my students think this is genius. And I think this is fascism. Another example, I don't know if you've experienced this one. Companies have started to integrate things like this. Your computer will just, on different intervals, give you a heart attack because it'll just stop working. And it'll say, take a break. And the computer will just lock. Doesn't matter what you were doing, just lock. I once topped out my grandmother's convertible on I-95 and had a similar experience where the car engine just locked. And it was like, you're not driving anymore. And I didn't know the engine could do that, so I just thought I was dead. I assumed this would be a similar experience if you were writing and the word was just like, nope. Chill out for 15 seconds. Very seductive. And then decisive, you see this, I've seen these all around Ottawa. They look aesthetic, but importantly, they're just traffic. You're not going here. Basically, living in Washington, D.C., we have lots of anti-tank deterrents. But they're often in the form of giant planters. So you see people like taking photos, eating lunch, next to no commie tanks this way. My favorite example is this one, because you've experienced this before, where your computer just tells you how dumb you are, like over and over again, right? Like, I want a password, you type password, and it's like, idiot, what are you doing to us? You're gonna get us in trouble. And then it requires that you basically like mine Bitcoin in order to save your password. So, their conclusion is that the argument is now essentially responsible, because of this awesome power, for shaping society. There's your Cambridge Analytica academic justification, right? They're just being good citizens. So, we're going to get to the Nietzsche part this way. It's going to happen. Nietzsche, 1887, Genealogy of Mortals, opens with this provocative question. We are unknown to ourselves. How should we ever find ourselves? And what's fascinating is this idea that we do not know who we are. So the one thing that you would think we do know, who I am, he says that's the last thing we know. And what's interesting is, if you try to break down what he's arguing, he has the leisure as liberation argument. He comes very close to Marxism for like a second. He says, we're busy bees, we're honey gatherers in spirit, so we're just too busy. And if we just didn't have to go to our stupid jobs, then we could be human beings. And importantly, in like one paragraph, he refutes Marx. Like, it's very quick. He doesn't even have to name him. It's a drive-by refutation. The real problem, Karl Marx, is this. The real problem is, I know my boss is making me busy. I don't mind. In fact, I like being busy. And he basically makes this argument that this is how we spend our time. And you've probably experienced this whenever you've said something stupid. Like, if I just had some free time, I'd write that novel. And you find that actually, like, you have a lot of free time. But then you would feel guilty and discover, like, you're probably not very good at writing. So you, like, really quickly make yourself busy. This is also probably what you do, like, on vacation, when you suddenly have, like, an itinerary, or you have a Google Map and you've starred, like, everything. And you're like, well, I can't leave this neighborhood. I hit every star, and I've got to be busy. I had yesterday free, and I was very busy. I could not be free. It was like I had things I had to do. So why do we do this to ourselves? Come on. There you go. You knew it. You knew it was coming at some point. Nihilism. That's my view. Nihilism. So what is nihilism? I'm writing a book for MIT Press right now, coming out next year. The title is just Nihilism. So I'm not going to spoil the surprise, but I will talk about it to some extent. So what is nihilism? Nietzsche gives a lot of different ideas about nihilism. He's really the philosopher who spends the most time thinking about nihilism. But one common theme is this idea that we are really, really full of hatred towards other human beings, including ourselves. It's not just others. Like, we just hate human. The way I like to think of this is that what Nietzsche is talking about is like if life was spent on a bus. Because you know when you get on a bus and you take your bag and you plop it down on the seat next to you, and that's your deterrent for anyone who would dare try to have a human interaction with you in public. And then you take your sunglasses and you put them on. There's no sunlight, doesn't matter. You put your earbuds. I don't want to hear anything. I always tell my students my $1 billion idea, nose buds. Just done. Done, right? Because I don't want to see, hear, touch, smell. I definitely don't want to taste any person on the bus, or generally, right? Just senseless experience, right? And it's again this fascinating thing. You put your bag down, and then someone has the gall And they don't ask. That's very important. Nobody ever asks, can I sit here? They kind of look. And it's like the most pathetic look. Right? They're like, and then you do this horrible thing where like you judge the person. Like, all right. And then they sit down and you're like, I just want you to know I let you do that. It's very important that you remember. Because if you cross this border, right, there's your Trumpian moment. You build the wall. And if they cross over, I'll kill you. Right? If you've ever had that experience where you're on a bus, especially when it's warm enough where you're wearing shorts, and you suddenly have like forehead knee contact, right? That's nihilism. That feeling of like, I just want to kill you. I don't care who you are, you might be good, it doesn't matter to me, you're dead to me, right? So, or as Nietzsche was it, we are weary of me. That's what I care. And one way of thinking about this is that Nietzsche says it's important to realize we are getting better. But maybe getting better is what's making us so sick. And it's important that he thinks of nihilism as very much like a disease. So we are safer, we are more civilized, we are more progressive, but we are more sick. And we are more sick because we are safer, better, more progressive. And he says the way we have done this is that we have created a world where we are more responsible because we are more predictable. And that this is how societies function. I need you to be predictable. I do not, as much as I say otherwise in a relationship, I do not want you to be spontaneous. You've experienced before, like you say to someone, I want you to be spontaneous, and then you come home and there's a cat, and you're like, what? I just meant like, let's have Italian on Tuesday. But importantly, Nietzsche predicted this, right? This is where, so he doesn't talk about technology, but in a way, he's seeing what's coming. This is why he keeps saying, I'm writing for the future. He says, my readers have not been born yet. So, what are we doing to ourselves? This is what I was getting at earlier. It's not about what technologies do to us. This is what nihilism helps us to see. It's what we do to ourselves through technology. That's the problem. So, one of my favorite concepts to attack, nudge. You hear this word way too much. I think they got a Nobel Prize for it. I mean, look at this. Right? I can make you healthier, wealthier, happier. Nietzsche would just be puking his guts out. And he says, importantly, Cass Sunstein and all nudge acolytes are basically priests. They're priests of this ascetic religion. This is why Nietzsche is so focused on religion. For him, the key is this concept of asceticism, of denying myself. And again, denying myself because of nihilism. I hate myself, so I destroy myself. I hate humanity, so I destroy humanity. I hate the world, so I destroy the world. And technology is the best way we've come up with to do it. But the problem is, for the priest needs to keep society together. Because if we're so destructive, we're not going to last very long. So in the third essay of the genealogy, he describes these various techniques that the priests use in order to essentially medicate us against our nihilism. So I've described these 5. And what I want to argue in my book is that we can do this. These are the new priests, and these are the new techniques. So, going back just briefly, if we remember postphenomenology, what I'm trying to do is basically combine their analyses of technology with Nietzsche's analyses of nihilism, so that we can do this. And think about what I call nihilism relations. where basically I want technology relating to the world and leave me out of it. That's the dream. The dream is the eyeless world. So in my book, I try to use Nietzsche's analyses of these five and update them for today. So the key idea here is that we try to avoid suffering through hypnosis. We have found even better ways than what Nietzsche talked about in the 19th century. TV, that one's pretty obvious. Binge watching. I love this ad, by the way. So this is an ad for having unlimited data so you can binge. The guy is on the beach. Why put him on the beach? What are you doing? Right? It's just fascinating. Like, obviously, you hate the world this much that you need to binge watch on the beach. Augmented reality. This is another one of my favorites. If you did not, Pokemon Go is another one that feels like 50 years ago. Like, this was like the biggest thing in the world, and now it's just dead. It's just dead. You talk about it, and you're like, I don't know what you're talking about. Virtual reality. This isn't a Black Mirror episode. This is a Zuckerberg advertisement. And this is probably the most Nietzschean image you can imagine. Especially because there are no women. And he says that's very important, that there are no women in our utopia. And it's this idea of just, I plug myself into the experience machine, and I just have no reality anymore. So what connects these four? They allow us to avoid feeling. That's very important. Mechanical activity. This is where he's basically talking about Protestantism, and the idea that the more obedient I am, the less I have to think. Again, Pokemon Go. This was another one like Apple Maps, where people were literally walking off cliffs. And it's just, well, clearly Pokemon Go is the problem. And I love that idea. I'm walking into traffic. Pokemon Go should have told me not to do that. Algorithms. Actually, Fitbit, just for a second. If you haven't experienced this already, this weird thing where you find yourself moving because it tells you to. There was one woman who wrote an account of her addiction, her Fitbit addiction. Maybe it'll be in the next DSM. Where she was up at 3 in the morning, climbing the steps of her apartment building because she had to reach the next milestone. And just, the Fitbit told her how close she was, she just had to do it. Algorithms are just taking over the world. I was going to go off on this whole tangent about BBC's Sherlock. In my book, I talk about how Benedict Cumberbatch is doing for algorithms and big data what Kiefer Sutherland in 24 did for torture. Because Sherlock Holmes is the embodiment of big data. And they show this on the screen, like he is immediately predicting that's who you are. And people go to him, read me. And the government sees him as the greatest tool, but also the greatest threat. But what's important for me is that algorithms, no one knows what's going on in there. So it's this weird thing, we keep talking about artificial intelligence, machine learning, but they are dumb. They are very dumb. If you remember when Deep Blue was on Jeopardy, there was this weird moment where the answer was something like, what is Toronto? And Deep Blue said something like, what is 13? And it's just funny. It was just funny. But it's important, this is the same technology that's now like diagnosing cancer. So you might get the what is 13, and we'll just be like, well, that was a glitch. But Deep Blue is really cool. And nobody can look in the program, literally, nobody can look into it and figure out why 13 popped up. Because there is nothing in the code that explains it. It's not possible. So the only way to do that, and this is why I love technology, well, we need to design a technology that could interpret the technology. And we are very much on Douglas Adams territory. So what are we doing? We just want to avoid all decision making. The petty pleasure. It's important, Nietzsche is not Ayn Rand. just to throw that out very quick. So he's not against helping, just to be clear. He's against helping people out of pity. And the idea that what's operating behind pity is that I can feel better than you. And that for him is what's really driving our desire to help. This one is probably the most obvious example. Crowdfunding. Why on earth are billions of dollars being moved around the world for strangers? Well, similar to why people are dating on Tinder. Similar to why you cannot use Airbnb while black. I am using these technologies to judge you and to have the power to judge. So importantly, Roman Emperor, Tinder, Facebook. It's the same thing. I mean, it's just, I'm going to judge you and reduce you to my thumb gesture. So what's the theme here? I avoid my feeling of powerlessness by reducing you to someone who is even more powerless than me. Herd formation, this is probably the one Nietzsche is most famous for. The one that makes angsty teenagers into Nietzscheans. You're just a bunch of sheep. And what's weird is social media just uses full-on Nietzsche language. You are my follower! It's just, follow me. I love this thing. Right? And again, it's important. The reason Facebook is not going anywhere, obvious. And the reason Mark Zuckerberg genuinely does not care about anything that's going on right now. Because their model is basically, I dare you to quit. In other words, Zuckerberg is, we're in an abusive relationship. And basically he's just like, there's the door. You want to leave? Go ahead. But no one's going to love you like me. And it's very important, this delete Facebook movement. Because if we don't all do it, nobody's going to do it. That's the whole trick. You might remember there was a year where this emoji, Oxford made the LOL emoji the emoji of the year. There's a website, emojitracker.com, which just puts in real time everyone's use of emojis on Twitter. People, well, one, the LOL emoji is in the lead by a lot, like by a factor of 10. And what's interesting is when you go to this website, it gives you an epilepsy warning, because that's how fast people are using emojis, and that's how fast it's updating. So when you look, like you're tripping out, like you just can't look at it and not move. And again, this idea, this is my real argument against Cambridge Analytica and what Facebook is doing. Facebook's model, on the one hand, is I dare you to quit. But on the other hand, it's you're a hypocrite. You are using me to spy on everybody. So how dare you accuse us of spying? That's why you came to us. So get off your high horse. You spent last night looking up all of your exes. That's all we did for Trump. So again, it's this idea that if we are a voyeuristic society, and Facebook is the #1 source of voyeurism, well then you can't be mad. That's what you wanted from us. So here we're avoiding individuality, if that wasn't clear. The last one, this is the one he says is the most dangerous. The orgies of feeling. This is where we get explosive. And it's very important for Nietzsche. It does not matter what emotion is motivating us. It's just that we have an instant explosion. So, this is what you see online. You go on Twitter to be mad. That's why you do it. You have pop-ups set on your phone and on your computer and on your voice assistant to enrage you at random intervals. Like you're eating, oh right, I should be mad. I wanted to go to bed, but I should be mad. It's just, I'm mad. So it should not surprise us again, I didn't want to put one photo. I wanted to hide him because he didn't have to deal with it all at once. This is what I call orgies of clicking. These sort of shame campaigns where you look at trends on Twitter, not just in order to become popular, but in order to get the pitchfork and take down whoever is today's victim. And I don't care what they did or who they are. It's just that I can riff on it and attack. So, we're trying to avoid responsibility. That's the key. Because these are all anonymous, I can just do whatever the hell I want. So again, I sort of skipped to the end of this a little bit, but I'm running out of time. What should responsibility mean? Nietzsche is very clear on this. Not anything that you think it means. That's it. And what's interesting is, back to this article, they do mention there was this one intersection in the Netherlands where they just could not find an intervention strategy to make it safer. And basically the city just got so fed up that they took it all down. And that's when people got safe. That was what finally worked, the no intervention intervention. So it was a very Nietzschean idea. When you stop trying to force people to become better, they might actually become better on their own. But it's very important for Nietzsche. We killed God. That's just a fact. I saw your giant spider outside the church. That was lovely. But the key for Nietzsche is this idea that we're just going to find new gods. So you have Zuckerberg. You have Facebook, not as a social media, it's a religion. And you have Google becoming the #1 source of ethics. The one commandment. You don't need 10. That's inefficient. Just Google. So my argument at the end of the book, which I have no time to go into, that's what we need to think about today. Is this possible? Because you see it on the news a lot. Is this the end? Of course. But why not? That's really what I want. Like, why not? Because clearly it should be, but why not? So even if Google were to die, even if Facebook were to die, we're just going to look for the next one. And this is what I see every article at the end of it. Delete Facebook, okay, but what are the alternatives? That's it. Thanks.
Great. Well, open up for a very brief period of questions. I don't know if you want to take it away. Yeah?
Hey,
Stephanie?
thanks for your talk. Loved it. No, I'm not a nihilist or smart or clever. I kind of write about technology in a very blunt, unsophisticated way. But one of the things that really intrigued me was at the beginning of your talk, you talked about your son and the fork. And your son wouldn't listen to you on how you should use the fork.
Right.
But then you also talked about how we listen to the Apple voice. So how does that take place? What's the mediation there? Like, how do we go from, wanting to stick our fork in our ear to driving off a cliff because Apple tells us to?
Right. Yeah. And I opened my book talking about my son more than I'm sure he'll appreciate. Because it is fascinating to me. He spends almost every morning wanting to watch YouTube. He's 3 years old, and he can already navigate YouTube very well. So what the hell's going on? Because he will listen when technologies tell him to do something, more than seemingly when I tell him to do something. So on the one hand, it does seem like there is something comforting about having a non-human master. And that's probably why we're so quick to dehumanize our boss. And why it's very upsetting to see your boss outside of work. And like, oh my God, they're a human being. I don't know what to do to them. So I think, so on the one hand, that's part of it. On the other hand, I think it's important that this is literally part of growing up. And this is what the Greeks said education was. Education was training to become civilized. So civilized today is doing what you're told. And the idea is that if technology is the master, then do what it says. And we just get very comfortable with that. So yeah, I think it's not a shock that is how we are progressing. And that we see this in schools, where we're introducing technology more and more into schools as part of the teaching apparatus. Like it would be weird today for me not to teach with PowerPoint. Like people would be baffled. So yeah, it's complicated, but I do think that this allows us to describe what's happening.
Thank you.
For the notions of responsibility, I find it weird that you ask what are we doing to ourselves through technology. So that's a big notion of responsibility, all incumbent to ourselves. But then you say we are avoiding responsibility by also, for example, we are the one doing that through technology. But I feel that there's a part that is also the notion of power too. It's like saying empower yourself, you're the one deciding your life or something. It's not completely true. There's also relations of power and dominant group. I don't know to you.
Yeah, I mean, I could have
To which
used...
extent is there?
Sorry?
To which extent is there like the dominant, not dominant group? It's more different, coming from different place and
Well, for...
like a dynamic process, but still, how can you explain? How can you bring the resistance or the? Yes.
Right. I mean, they're not two different things. So responsibility and power are tied. So for existentialism, freedom and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. I am responsible to the degree that I am free. And I am free only because and only to the extent that I'm responsible. And so for them, the rise of fascism was not a shock because nobody wants to be responsible. Democracy puts too much pressure on us. We don't want it. So we willingly embrace Cambridge Analytica.
So it's a consent, but the consent is means something, or we should say that's a values consent.
Yeah, and this is the birth of liberalism, right? The only power you have in a liberal society is consent. That's all you are, consent. This is why Locke was already talking about the Me Too movement. It's already there. You got to dig it out. But I do think he's talking about Aziz Ansari in the 17th century. But this idea that, so when I gave my TED Talk, for example, I talked about responsibility, and people came up to me and said, okay, so what should I do? And I said, no, that's the problem that my talk was about, asking other people, what should I do? And they said, okay, I get it, but like, what should I do? Right, like just give me an answer. And interestingly, Sartre tries to turn this. So he says, there is no Kant, there's you. There's your reading of Kant. And you will read Kant however you choose to read Kant, whether you want to admit it or not. But you do not want that responsibility, so you say, no, Kant told me to do it. So I think it's again important that these issues are entangled, and it's not an either-or situation. So I think what I'm talking about and what you're talking about are both there. And I could have written this whole book with Foucault instead of Nietzsche.
Yes, because in criminology we say governmentality.
Yeah, right.
So that's, I felt there was a part of him a bit in the presentation of governmentality and how, the body just...
Right, but Foucault was inspired by Nietzsche, so I figured I'll just go to the source.
Okay.
Yeah.
Isn't the situation actually more serious than you describe? It's not just the interaction of individuals with the technology, but there are massive efforts now using technology as the enabler for massive efforts to using social media to destabilize countries and undermine liberal democracy on a vast scale.
Right.
Combine that with lying at a political level that is unprecedented. For example, the lying that took place and the fear-mongering in the lead up to the vote on Brexit.
Right.
And now the consequences for an entire country and continent seems far more enormous than the consequences you described.
Yeah, right. Thanks. I always like hearing that I'm not as negative as I think I am. But well, on the one hand, my previous book was about war, so I didn't want to do another war book. But on the other hand, what Nietzsche is talking about nihilism, he's talking about it both individually, but also culturally. And again, these are for him entangled into each other. So he thinks nihilism is embedded into morality and religion. They're embedded into our politics. So what I'm describing on an individual level isn't an individual-only phenomenon. And that it's through understanding nihilism that we can then, I think, build up to that level. But I think if we start at that level, then we tend to ignore the individual aspect of it. So I would rather have a ground up.
In understanding the idea of entanglement and what maybe Nietzsche might have said about power, what do you think is there anything that was said about psychology or non-human and how you relate or interact with that as
Right.
opposed to this?
So about environmentalism.
Well, I think you mentioned the tour.
Right. Well, we clearly, on one hand, expect technology to fix it. But because of that, again, I'm relieved of the responsibility of having to do anything with it. So this is seen as an Elon Musk problem, not as a me problem. This is a government problem. It's not a me problem. And this is similar to, if someone tries to make you vegetarian and they start talking about the meat industry, you're like, well, that's the meat industry. What's my burger? Like, the cow is already dead. It seems disrespectful for me not to eat it. So you get into like very quick reduction and elevation issues, right? But I do think it's important the degree to which, and this is what Heidegger was talking about, that our instrumental way of seeing is how we see the environment. And that's why he says this is how we see everything. And so he talks a lot about the environment. And ecologists and Heidegger have an interesting relationship. This is something that I could have talked more about. I didn't really get into. It is an important question. But it is, again, this idea that on the one hand, I want technology to fix it. On the other hand, if it doesn't, it'll take me to Mars. So either way, it's an Elon Musk problem.
At the end, you just said, like, is this the end of the alternative or something? And for me, just I personally have drawn, and this is external, but I would draw indigenous epistemology or cosmology and which actually, like, for me, that's during my own kind of analysis, my experience with this crap.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, anyways.
Yeah, and I think that's much closer to, again, what Heidegger was trying to do. Similar to Aldo Leopold is another one, important conservationist in America. And this idea that Aldo Leopold was already talking about 60 years ago, what maps do to our relationship to the environment. That I go through the forest but I never look at the forest, I look at what I'm holding. So this is already a distancing from nature. And even when I do go to the forest, I go in order to get healthy, be outside, to relax. It's never for nature. And that's why for Heidegger it's all about the in order to-ness, that everything is in order to-ness.
Well, recently, I guess you can say yesterday, reread The Birth of Tragedy of the Spirit of Music. It seems to me that what Nietzsche is saying, that the Dionysian spirit, let's say, art, was destroyed by Socrates and rationalism, and our world today is a rational world. And it's not very happy because it's rational, and art is, I think Nietzsche says that art is justifies life. Everybody should be an artist. The other morality, and that's the separate, which we're all living, whether we like it or not, I suppose, except maybe perhaps in the Far East. But the other morality that Nietzsche obviously disagrees with is the Christian morality. Antichrist is completely so unless we are all very much prepared to say we're not Christian, that doesn't attack Christ. Right? It simply attacks Christianity, that Christianity is a dead end of life. To sum all that up, and Nietzsche doesn't attack, religion and technology to me is science.
Right.
So there's no connection between technology and religion, as you mentioned, that the new technocrats are, instilling the same kind of bear with life, to do all sorts of boring things. I don't think Nietzsche does admire science. If you're a good scientist, it's a great life. If you're a good scientist and really are devoted to your science, you can have a pretty good, even if art is another. But certainly religion seems to be, he feels that, at least the Christian religion, well, maybe other religions too are not
Yeah.
the problem rather than the solution.
Well, in the genealogy, he makes very clear, science is not the enemy of religion, it is religion. Science relies on faith.
True enough.
Science
I feel he's satisfied that it doesn't. Art is the best, but science is fine.
Well, yeah, but even so, again, Birth of Tragedy, he's still very Schopenhauerian. So 20 years later is what I'm talking about. And 20 years later, he's moved away from Schopenhauer, thanks to some extent because of Wagner, and seen that art isn't the answer either. And he's left in the third essay at the very end, really saying, I don't know what the opposition is. Where is the opposition? We have aesthetic values, and aesthetic values run through religion, science, art, philosophy. None of those are opposing. They're all Judeo-Christian. And I'm trying to argue technology is too. So don't be evil, in the last chapter of the book, I try to show isn't the enemy of Christianity, it just is Christian. And the closest answer he has, which I find fascinating, is comedy. Comedy might be the answer. And I think, to some extent, that's how, in Will to Power, he starts to talk about how the only way to defeat nihilism might be nihilism itself. And he makes this distinction between active and passive nihilism. And this idea that if you can essentially turn nihilism against itself, then you might be able to destroy it through its own destructive tendency. And that's essentially what he sees comedy as. If you have a sarcastic wit, then you're safe.
I unfortunately, because we're really out of time, the room has been booked after this. I want to congratulate and thank Dr. Gertz for a fascinating presentation.